When the Second World War began, naval power was still defined by ideas inherited from an earlier age. For decades, the battleship had stood at the center of maritime strategy, symbolizing dominance through armor, artillery, and raw displacement. Admirals believed that future wars at sea would be decided by decisive surface engagements, where fleets met face to face and settled the outcome through gunfire and maneuver. Control of the ocean, in this worldview, belonged to the ship that could outshoot and outlast its opponent. Aircraft carriers existed at the edges of this doctrine, but they were not yet trusted. Many naval commanders viewed them as auxiliary vessels, useful for reconnaissance, spotting enemy formations, or providing limited air cover to the main fleet. Carriers appeared fragile when compared to battleships, lacking heavy armor and depending on aircraft that could be lost to weather, mechanical failure, or enemy fire. In an era shaped by steel and guns, relying on aircraft seemed risky and uncertain. Yet the aircraft carrier represented something fundamentally different. It was not simply a ship with planes on its deck, but a mobile airbase capable of projecting power far beyond the horizon. Within its hull were fuel depots, ammunition magazines, repair workshops, command centers, radar rooms, medical bays, and living quarters for hundreds or even thousands of men. Every carrier functioned as a self-contained system, a floating city sustained by logistics, coordination, and constant movement across the sea. The true strength of the carrier was reach. Unlike battleships, it did not need to see the enemy to strike. Its aircraft could travel hundreds of kilometers, attacking ships, ports, and airfields long before defenders were aware of the threat. Naval combat was no longer confined to visual range or gunfire. For the first time in history, control of the sea depended on control of the air above it. Life aboard these floating cities reflected their complexity and danger. Flight decks were among the most hazardous workplaces of the war, crowded with aircraft, fuel lines, spinning propellers, and exposed munitions. Pilots launched and landed within meters of catastrophe, while below-deck mechanics worked endlessly to keep engines operational under combat conditions. Every mission carried the understanding that failure meant fire, sinking, or isolation in open ocean. As the war expanded across the Pacific and Atlantic, this new reality forced itself into strategic thinking. Battleships continued to sail, but increasingly they did so in support of carriers rather than as the decisive weapon themselves. Naval warfare was undergoing a transformation, one driven not by tradition, but by necessity. The aircraft carrier was no longer an experiment. It was becoming the center of modern war at sea. Before the Second World War, naval aviation existed in an uncertain space between experimentation and doctrine. Aircraft had proven useful in reconnaissance and limited strikes, but few commanders believed they could replace battleships as the decisive force at sea. Carriers were often assigned secondary roles, operating in support of surface fleets rather than leading them. Doctrine evolved slowly, constrained by tradition, budget limitations, and skepticism from senior officers trained in the age of big guns. Yet events in the interwar years began to challenge these assumptions. Naval exercises conducted by several major powers repeatedly demonstrated that aircraft could strike fleets before they were detected by surface ships. Simulated attacks showed that carriers could disable battleships at distances where return fire was impossible. Despite this, many of these results were dismissed as unrealistic or overly optimistic, failing to overcome institutional resistance. The outbreak of war forced rapid adaptation. As fleets mobilized, commanders began to recognize that air power at sea offered unmatched flexibility. Carriers could scout vast areas, respond quickly to emerging threats, and concentrate force at chosen points. Unlike battleships, whose power was fixed in their guns, carriers could adapt mission by mission, launching fighters, bombers, or reconnaissance aircraft as the situation demanded. This shift required new ways of thinking. Task forces were reorganized around carriers rather than gun platforms. Escort ships were assigned to protect flight decks instead of forming battle lines. Communication, coordination, and timing became as critical as firepower. A carrier's effectiveness depended not only on its aircraft, but on the seamless integration of pilots, deck crews, intelligence officers, and command staff. By the early years of the war, carrier doctrine was no longer theoretical. It was being tested in combat, refined through experience, and paid for in blood and steel. The age of the battleship had not ended overnight, but its dominance was fading. In its place rose a new center of naval power, one defined by flight decks, aircraft, and the ability to strike first. An aircraft carrier at war was not just a weapon, but a living organism. Thousands of men worked and slept within its steel hull, each performing specialized tasks that kept the ship and its air wing operational. From the bridge to the engine rooms, from the flight deck to the lowest compartments, every space was designed for efficiency rather than comfort. Once at sea, the carrier became a closed world, isolated from land and entirely dependent on discipline and coordination. Life aboard was governed by routine and urgency. Watches ran around the clock. Aircraft maintenance never truly stopped. Pilots prepared for missions while mechanics worked beneath their planes, often under extreme heat, noise, and exhaustion. Below deck, crews moved through narrow corridors packed with machinery, fuel lines, ammunition, and cables. Privacy was non-existent, and rest came in short, interrupted periods between alarms and flight operations. The flight deck was the heart of the carrier and its most dangerous space. Launching and recovering aircraft required absolute precision. Planes roared forward only meters from the edge of the ship, while others returned under fire, damage, or low fuel. A single mistake, a slipped cable, a mistimed signal, a stalled engine, could result in explosions, fires, or men being swept into the sea. Accidents were frequent, even without enemy action. Despite these risks, morale remained surprisingly resilient. The shared danger forged strong bonds among the crew. Sailors, pilots, and officers depended on one another in ways few land forces experienced. Survival was collective. Success or failure belonged to the entire ship, not just those who flew the missions. In this environment, the aircraft carrier revealed its true nature. It was not a single weapon, but a complex system where human effort mattered as much as steel and machinery. Every sortie launched from the deck represented the labor of hundreds. Every recovery was a small victory against the chaos of war at sea. On the morning of December 7th, 1941, naval warfare changed forever. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor was not merely a surprise strike against the United States. It was a demonstration of what aircraft carriers could achieve when used decisively. In a matter of hours, battleships that symbolized American naval power were damaged, sunk, or rendered ineffective without a traditional fleet engagement ever taking place. The era of the battleship was not officially over, but its supremacy had been shattered. The attack exposed the vulnerability of even the most heavily armored ships when faced with coordinated air power. Torpedo bombers and dive bombers struck targets that battleship guns could neither see nor reach. Harbor defenses proved inadequate against aircraft launched hundreds of kilometers away. For naval planners around the world, the message was unmistakable. Control of the air now determined control of the sea. Pearl Harbor also revealed the strategic potential of carriers beyond tactical damage. The attacking fleet projected power across vast distances, coordinated multiple waves of aircraft, and withdrew without being engaged by surface forces. This was naval warfare conducted at a new scale and speed. Battleships survived the attack, but the doctrine that had built them did not. In the aftermath, the United States Navy was forced to adapt rapidly. With much of its battleship force disabled, carriers became the primary offensive instruments almost by default. What began as necessity soon became doctrine. Task forces were reorganized, training accelerated, and resources redirected toward naval aviation at unprecedented levels. Pearl Harbor did not end the battleship overnight, but it ended the illusion that big guns alone could decide naval wars. From that moment forward, aircraft carriers stood at the center of maritime strategy. The war at sea would be decided not by who had the largest ships, but by who could launch and protect aircraft more effectively than their enemy. After Pearl Harbor, the Pacific Ocean transformed into a battlefield defined almost entirely by aircraft carriers. The vast distances between islands and continents made traditional surface engagements impractical. Fleets rarely encountered one another directly. Instead, opposing forces searched the horizon and the sky, knowing that the first carrier to locate its enemy could strike without ever being seen. Carrier battles in the Pacific unfolded unlike any naval conflicts before them. Ships often never fired their guns at one another. The decisive moments occurred hundreds of kilometers away, where aircraft met aircraft and bombs fell on decks that pilots would never see with their own eyes. Victory depended on scouting, timing, and coordination rather than armor or gunnery. This new form of warfare demanded rapid learning. Early battles exposed weaknesses on all sides, limited aircraft range, unreliable communications, and inexperienced pilots. Losses were heavy, and mistakes were punished instantly. Yet each engagement forced adaptation. Tactics evolved quickly as commanders learned how to concentrate air power, defend carriers with fighter screens, and recover aircraft under combat conditions. Industrial capacity soon became as important as battlefield skill. The United States, in particular, began producing carriers, aircraft, and trained air crews at a scale its opponents could not match. Losses that would have crippled other navies became setbacks that could be absorbed and replaced. The carrier war in the Pacific was not just a contest of fleets, but of factories and logistics. As battles stretched from the Coral Sea to Midway and beyond, it became clear that the outcome of the Pacific War would be decided by carriers. Islands mattered because they supported air operations. Naval engagements mattered because they shaped air superiority. The ocean itself became a platform for aviation, and the aircraft carrier its most powerful expression. Combat on an aircraft carrier was defined by constant exposure to danger. Unlike battleships, which concentrated risk around moments of surface engagement, carriers lived in a permanent state of vulnerability. Their flight decks were crowded with fueled aircraft, loaded munitions, and exposed crews. A single bomb or torpedo could ignite chain reactions capable of crippling or destroying an entire ship. Air attacks unfolded with brutal speed. Enemy aircraft appeared with little warning, forcing crews into rehearsed routines drilled endlessly at sea. Anti-aircraft guns filled the sky with fire as fighters scrambled to intercept attackers. Pilots landed damaged aircraft, while explosions rocked the deck beneath them. Fires spread quickly, fed by fuel and ammunition, demanding immediate and coordinated damage control to prevent catastrophe. Survival depended on training and discipline. Damage control teams fought fires, sealed flooded compartments, and cleared wreckage, while flight operations continued whenever possible. Carriers that survived devastating hits often did so because crews acted decisively in the first critical minutes. Failure to contain fires or flooding meant the loss of both ship and air group. The psychological strain was immense. Crews lived with the knowledge that their ship was a primary target. There was no safe place on board during an attack, yet operations continued relentlessly. Aircraft were repaired, rearmed, and launched again, even as smoke hung over the deck and wounded men were carried below. These decks of steel became arenas where technology, human endurance, and organization collided. Victory was not determined by a single act of heroism, but by sustained performance under extreme pressure. In the skies above and on the decks below, the aircraft carrier proved itself both powerful and fragile, a weapon that demanded constant vigilance to survive. At the center of carrier warfare were the men who operated its aircraft. Naval pilots lived with a level of risk unmatched in most other branches of the war. Every mission required taking off from a moving deck barely long enough for error, flying into hostile airspace, and returning to land on the same narrow strip of steel, often damaged, often in poor weather, and sometimes under fire. Survival depended as much on skill and luck as on courage. Training was intense, but often insufficient. Early in the war, many pilots entered combat with limited flight hours and minimal combat experience. Losses were severe, especially during the first carrier battles. Over time, surviving airmen accumulated experience, refined tactics, and passed hard-earned lessons to new arrivals. Carrier aviation became a profession shaped by constant learning and relentless attrition. Below deck, thousands of others made flight operations possible. Deck crews guided aircraft through chaos using hand signals alone. Mechanics repaired engines damaged by combat or salt air. Ordnance crews armed bombs and torpedoes, knowing that a single mistake could kill everyone nearby. These men rarely appeared in victory reports, yet without them, no aircraft would ever leave the deck. The bond between air crews and ship crews was absolute. Pilots depended on the ship not only to launch them, but to bring them home. Recovery operations continued under the most dangerous conditions, sometimes until the last light faded, because leaving airmen in the water meant almost certain death. Every landing was a collective effort. Carrier warfare blurred the line between individual and system. Skill mattered, but it was never enough on its own. Success came from coordination between pilots, deck crews, intelligence officers, and commanders, all functioning as parts of a single, fragile machine. The men who flew and fought from carriers were not lone warriors. They were elements of a floating city at war. As the war progressed, aircraft carriers became more than tactical weapons. They became products of industrial power. Carrier warfare demanded an enormous flow of ships, aircraft, fuel, spare parts, and trained personnel. Victory at sea increasingly depended not only on what happened in battle, but on what could be built, repaired, and replaced faster than the enemy could destroy it. No nation embodied this reality more clearly than the United States. American shipyards began launching carriers at an unprecedented pace, ranging from massive fleet carriers to smaller escort carriers designed to support convoys and amphibious operations. Losses that would have crippled other navies were absorbed and answered with new hulls, new air groups, and fresh crews. The carrier became a repeatable weapon, not a rare asset. Aircraft production followed the same logic. New fighters and bombers entered service faster than older models were lost. Improvements were continuous rather than revolutionary. Better engines, stronger airframes, longer range, improved weapons. Training pipelines expanded to feed this system, ensuring that carriers rarely sailed without full air groups. This industrial advantage reshaped strategy. Commanders could take risks knowing that losses, while costly, were not fatal to the war effort. Opponents without comparable production capacity were forced into caution, conserving ships and pilots they could not easily replace. The balance of power shifted steadily toward those who could sustain operations indefinitely. Carrier warfare thus became a contest of endurance. Battles were still decided by skill and timing, but campaigns were decided by logistics and output. The floating cities of war were supported by cities on land, factories, ports, and training bases working in constant coordination. At sea, aircraft carriers fought the enemy. Behind them, entire nations fought to keep them alive. Aircraft carrier warfare was marked by sudden destruction and narrow survival. When carriers were hit, the consequences were immediate and devastating. Bombs and torpedoes struck flight decks crowded with aircraft, fuel, and ammunition, turning ships into infernos within minutes. Fires spread rapidly through hangars and corridors, while explosions tore open hulls and flooded compartments. Damage control became a battle of its own. Crews fought flames with hoses, sand, and sheer desperation, often while the ship was still under attack. Flooding had to be contained before stability was lost. Wounded men were pulled from smoke-filled spaces as others took their places at repair stations. Survival depended on speed, coordination, and the ability to impose order on chaos. Many carriers were lost not because they were poorly designed, but because the margin for error was thin. A single bomb penetrating the wrong space could ignite stored fuel or detonate munitions. In several battles, carriers survived initial hits only to succumb later when fires could not be contained or structural damage proved fatal. Losses were often sudden, leaving little time for evacuation. Yet these disasters also revealed extraordinary resilience. Some carriers absorbed damage that should have destroyed them and remained operational through disciplined crew action. Makeshift repairs kept ships afloat long enough to reach safety. Lessons learned from each loss improved future designs, fire suppression systems, and damage control procedures. Carrier warfare was therefore a constant balance between vulnerability and survival. Every battle tested not only the ship and its aircraft, but the human ability to endure catastrophe and continue fighting. Fire and loss were ever-present realities, but so was the determination to keep these floating cities alive under the most extreme conditions imaginable. While the Pacific War showcased aircraft carriers at their most dramatic, carrier operations were not limited to that ocean alone. In the Atlantic and Mediterranean, carriers played a different but equally vital role. Here, the enemy was not always another fleet, but submarines, long supply routes, and the constant threat of disruption to Allied logistics. Escort carriers became essential tools of survival. Smaller and slower than fleet carriers, They lacked the striking power needed for major naval battles, but they carried aircraft capable of hunting submarines, protecting convoys, and extending air cover far beyond the reach of land-based planes. These modest ships helped close the Atlantic air gap, transforming the ocean from a hunting ground for submarines into a monitored and defended space. Carrier aircraft in these theaters flew missions that rarely attracted attention. They patrolled empty seas, escorted merchant ships, and searched relentlessly for periscopes and shadows beneath the waves. Success was measured not in dramatic victories, but in ships that arrived safely and supply lines that remained intact. This quiet form of carrier warfare proved decisive in sustaining Allied war efforts on multiple fronts. In the Mediterranean, carriers supported amphibious landings and provided air cover for advancing armies. Their aircraft struck ports, airfields, and coastal defenses, enabling operations that would have been impossible without mobile air power at sea. Carriers bridged the gap between naval and ground warfare, shaping campaigns far from the open ocean battles of the Pacific. These roles demonstrated the full versatility of the aircraft carrier. It was not only a weapon of fleet engagement, but a strategic asset capable of adapting to vastly different environments. Whether hunting submarines or supporting invasions, carriers extended Allied reach and ensured that control of the sea translated into control of events ashore. Aircraft carriers did not remain static throughout the war. Every major engagement exposed weaknesses, and each loss forced rapid innovation. Design changes, tactical adjustments, and technological improvements were introduced not in peacetime laboratories, but in the middle of ongoing combat. Carrier warfare evolved under pressure, shaped by necessity rather than theory. Early carriers suffered from limited protection and inefficient layouts. Fires spread easily through hangars, fuel systems proved vulnerable, and aircraft handling was slow under combat conditions. As the war progressed, armored flight decks, improved fire suppression systems, and better compartmentalization were introduced. Damage control procedures were refined, turning survival into a trained discipline rather than an improvised response. Radar and communications technology transformed carrier operations. Improved detection allowed earlier warnings of incoming attacks, giving fighters more time to intercept enemy aircraft. Coordination between ships within a task force became more precise, allowing carriers to operate as integrated groups rather than isolated platforms. Information flowed faster, reducing surprise and increasing reaction speed. Aircraft themselves evolved just as rapidly. Fighters gained greater speed, range, and firepower. Bombers carried heavier payloads and improved targeting systems. These changes extended the carrier's reach and increased its lethality, while also raising the demands placed on pilots and deck crews. Every technological advance required new training, new procedures, and new risks. Innovation under fire came at a cost. Changes were often implemented quickly, sometimes imperfectly, and always under operational pressure. Yet this constant adaptation gave carriers a decisive advantage. They were not just powerful weapons, they were flexible systems capable of learning faster than their enemies. In a war defined by change, that ability proved critical. By the middle years of the war, aircraft carriers had become the decisive instruments through which momentum at sea was gained and lost. Early uncertainty gave way to confidence as doctrines matured and experience accumulated. Carrier task forces no longer reacted blindly to enemy movements. They anticipated them, shaping battles before they fully unfolded. Control of the air increasingly meant control of the campaign. The turning point came not from a single battle, but from a sequence of engagements where carriers proved their ability to absorb losses and continue operating. Each encounter refined tactics, better coordination between scouting aircraft, tighter fighter screens, and more disciplined strike planning. Enemy fleets found themselves forced onto the defensive, reacting to carrier-launched attacks rather than initiating them. Attrition played a decisive role. Opponents, who could not replace lost carriers, aircraft, and trained crews, saw their operational reach shrink steadily. Even when individual battles were costly, the side with greater industrial depth retained the initiative. Carrier warfare rewarded those who could sustain pressure over time rather than those who sought decisive moments alone. As the tide turned, carriers shifted from survival to dominance. They supported island-hopping campaigns, isolated enemy garrisons, and denied opponents the ability to concentrate forces. Air power at sea became a tool of strategic control, shaping not only naval engagements, but the broader course of the war across entire regions. By this stage, the outcome was no longer in doubt. Aircraft carriers had proven that naval power was no longer anchored to armor and guns, but to adaptability, coordination, and sustained air superiority. The war at sea had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. By the final years of the Second World War, aircraft carriers had grown larger, more complex, and more specialized than ever before. Early experimental designs were replaced by mature warships built around hard-earned experience. These late-war carriers reflected lessons learned through fire, loss, and adaptation, embodying a new understanding of what naval power required in the modern age. Flight decks expanded to accommodate larger air groups and faster aircraft. Hangars were reorganized for efficiency and survivability. Anti-aircraft defenses multiplied, creating dense protective screens against incoming attacks. Carriers were no longer fragile experiments, but hardened platforms designed to operate continuously in hostile environments. Their presence reshaped entire theaters of war. Late-war carrier task forces operated with a confidence unimaginable in 1941. Coordinated strikes involved hundreds of aircraft launched in carefully timed waves. Enemy fleets and shore installations were struck repeatedly, denying opponents the chance to recover. The carrier had become not just a weapon, but the center of an integrated system that included escorts, logistics ships, intelligence networks, and air cover extending far beyond the horizon. These giants also symbolized industrial dominance. Building and maintaining such ships required immense resources, skilled labor, and uninterrupted supply chains. Nations capable of sustaining this effort controlled the pace of the war at sea. Those who could not were forced into defensive postures, conserving remaining assets rather than challenging carrier groups directly. By 1945, the aircraft carrier stood as the undisputed ruler of the oceans. Battleships still existed, but their role had been irrevocably changed. The future of naval warfare had arrived not with a single decisive moment, but through steady transformation. The giants of the late war were proof that control of the sea now belonged to those who commanded the air above it. When the fighting began to slow and victory came into view, the aircraft carrier emerged as one of the war's clearest lessons. It had not simply replaced the battleship, it had rewritten the logic of naval warfare. Power at sea was no longer measured by armor thickness or gun range, but by reach, coordination, and the ability to adapt faster than the enemy. The war demonstrated that no single ship, however powerful, could operate alone. Carriers thrived only as part of carefully structured task forces, protected by escorts and sustained by logistics. Intelligence, radar, communications, and air patrols were just as critical as aircraft and pilots. Naval warfare had become systemic, where success depended on how well each element supported the others. Aircraft carriers also revealed the limits of tradition. Navies that clung too tightly to old doctrines paid a heavy price in the early years of the war. Those that learned quickly, accepting losses, revising tactics, and reorganizing command structures, gained decisive advantages. Flexibility became a strategic weapon in its own right. Equally important were the human lessons. Carrier crews showed that modern war demanded not only courage, but endurance under constant pressure. Long deployments, relentless operations, and exposure to sudden destruction tested discipline and morale as severely as any battlefield. Victory belonged to those who could sustain effort over time, not just those who struck hardest. By the end of the war, these lessons were unmistakable. Steel alone no longer decided naval power. The aircraft carrier stood as proof that modern warfare favored integrated systems, continuous learning, and the ability to project force far beyond the visible horizon. The future of the world's oceans had been written in steel and flight decks. When the Second World War finally ended, aircraft carriers did not disappear with the guns falling silent. Instead, they remained, not just as surviving ships, but as proof that naval warfare had crossed a point of no return. The war had revealed that control of the oceans was no longer about who possessed the heaviest armor or the largest guns. It was about who could project power, sustain operations, and adapt faster than any opponent. The aircraft carrier's legacy was built on endurance rather than spectacle. It rarely delivered victory in a single moment. Instead, it shaped entire campaigns over months and years, enabling landings, protecting supply lines, and denying the enemy freedom of movement. Every major Allied operation depended on carriers in some form, whether visible on the horizon or operating far beyond it. Post-war navies absorbed these lessons quickly. Battleships faded into secondary roles or museums, while carriers became the centerpiece of maritime strategy. Nations invested not just in hulls, but in the systems that made carriers effective: air wings, training pipelines, logistics networks, and global command structures. The floating city became the standard unit of naval power. Yet the true legacy of the carrier was human as much as technological. Thousands of men lived, worked, and fought aboard these ships, bound together by routines, risks, and shared survival. Their war was fought on steel decks and in narrow corridors, under constant threat from the sky and sea alike. What they built through discipline and cooperation outlasted the conflict itself. In the end, aircraft carriers did more than win battles. They changed how wars were fought and how power was measured. The oceans of the modern world are still shaped by the lessons learned between 1939 and 1945. Floating cities of war became enduring symbols of a new age, one where the horizon was no longer a limit, but a launch point.